Hello, I'm Mark Skorka, president of Opera America. Good morning if you're on the West Coast, good afternoon on the East Coast, and good evening if you are a member of Opera Europa watching our session. This is the third installment in Opera America's online Opera Conference 2020, and it deals with a very important topic, creating real belonging. This topic aligns with so much of the work that Opera America has been doing over the last several years in the area of civic practice. We've had civic practice workshops across the country supported by the National Endowment for the Arts, and we've introduced civic practice grants supported by our own Opera Fund. Throughout all of this work, we want to share the inspiration and share the beauty of opera with new people, people who haven't come into the opera house or participated in the lives of our opera companies. But when we bring them into our community, we want to make sure they feel welcome. We want to make sure that newcomers don't leave immediately because they don't feel they belong, that they might not feel they belong in our community. They may not feel that opera belongs to them. So this is the topic that we want to address today, this concept of creating real belonging. This session is sponsored, and we're very grateful to them, by Fisher Dax. Fisher Dax is based in New York, and it's one of the world's leading theater planning and design consultants. They have supported our opera conference every year since 2007. It's 14 years, and we're deeply grateful for their steadfast support of our work. I'd like to thank Nina Simon for her wonderful introductory presentation. She brought to the table concepts and strategies that I think we all felt were very valuable. The chat room was filled with appreciative comments. So thanks to Nina. We have a wonderful panel this afternoon in alphabetical order. Teresa Ruth Howard, who is a dancer, teacher, writer, blogger, and a great observer of the arts community. Quodizia Johnson, who is the Education and Company Culture Manager at the Dallas Opera. It's one of my favorite titles in our industry, Education and Company Culture Manager. Huang Ro is a celebrated composer and conductor. If you were with us at our 2018 conference in St. Louis, you saw the premiere production of his opera American Soldier, and we regret that we didn't quite get to see the new opera M Butterfly that would have premiered in Santa Fe this summer if it were not for the crisis of COVID. Ryan Taylor, who is the president and general director of Minnesota Opera, and Mark Valdez. He's a director, writer, and producer. He also has been our lead faculty member in the civic practice workshops that we've done across the country. All of these wonderful panelists will be led in discussion by Alejandra Valerino Boyer. She is Seattle Opera's Director of Programs and Partnerships. She too has been a faculty member for our workshops. She's a great friend of Opera America. And Alejandra, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you so much for having me here today. And thank you all for joining us for this important conversation. As Mark mentioned, I'm Alejandra Valerino Boyer, Director of Programs and Partnerships at Seattle Opera. And again, I'm just truly honored to be facilitating the conversation today. Before we begin, I want to just talk through a couple of items. Taking our cue from Nina's presentation, we're going to be really specific about who matters to us in this conversation. And this conversation is specifically about communities and people of color. I also want to acknowledge the emotional labor taken on by our panelists of color, and that we are willingly taking on additional emotional labor by engaging in this conversation. So I want to thank them all for taking part in this with me. This is not meant to be a one-on-one conversation. And so in order to dig in fully and to move ahead quickly, the panelists will not be defining terms and concepts unless they want to. And the Opera America staff will be supporting this by providing definitions via the chat function and providing resources. I hope that everyone had the opportunity to hear Nina Simon's presentation on belonging. The concept of, by, for as a way to create inclusive spaces isn't necessarily a new concept, but one that we so easily lose sight of when we're seeking new audiences and ways to stay relevant. And she lays it out so beautifully and in a way that makes it easier for everyone to engage in this work. So if you haven't seen the presentation, please go see it after this conversation. And if you haven't yet read her book, The Art of Relevance, I highly suggest it. When I think about belonging in opera for people of color, I am taken back to an early memory living in my hometown of Orlando. My mom, grandmother, and I went to see a zarzuela at Orlando Opera. And at that point, I was a well-trained opera goer, and I was a light-skinned Latina living in a white world, still am. So I knew how to behave accordingly. This was before I even knew what code switching was. My grandmother was a very proper lady, Puerto Rican, and she grew up on zarzuelas. So that meant that she had the right to sing along to the entire opera. She did it quietly, but it was definitely audible. And had we not been sitting around our Latinx community that my mom had helped to bring together, feeling so proud of hearing our Spanish language on the stage, of seeing Latinx singers, even a Puerto Rican singer on that stage, it would have turned out so differently. And I know this because so many times leading up to that moment, and definitely after, my Latinidad was not welcome in white opera spaces. It had to be checked at the door, which is a privilege that I have being light-skinned, or used to make me unique. Like Nina said in her presentation, belonging involves a sense of ownership. We belong to the place we love, and those places belong to us. That is what I felt in that moment, and in the moments in my career when I've been lucky enough to co-create space with communities of color. When white-led institutions or majority white-led institutions embark on a true journey of creating belonging for people of color, to me, it means allowing oneself to let go of the normal way of doing things, to allow space for people and communities of color to bring in their traditions and cultures, to create space for Alana voices in the decision-making process so that something new can be created together. And I will add that at this time, as so many companies are kicking into survival mode, I do fear that we'll pick the easiest way out, that we'll revert back to old habits and racist systems, scarcity mindset and closed door conversations, and that we'll put racial equity and inclusion on the back burner until things become stable again. But it's also a time for opportunity, and I'm totally thrilled to be joined by an extraordinary group of individuals whose work I absolutely admire and who are just downright great people. The panelists have been asked to make some remarks about what belonging means to them and some ideas and ways that the opera field can move forward to be an inclusive space for a lot of people. They've been asked to do this in 3 minutes, the length of the Gettysburg Address, which is kind of hard, but I think we'll be able to manage. And then we'll have tons of time to enter into a really robust conversation. You may have questions as we go along, and so please ask those in that chat box, and we'll try to get to as many of those as possible during our time together. I'm going to ask Quo to kick us off and get us started with our remarks.
Thank you so much. I'm excited. For me, belonging means that I can contribute unapologetically my full self in the space, right? There is no question, there is no doubt, there's no argument as to whether or not I should be in this space because I'm supposed to be there, right? When you belong, you are supposed to be there. And your presence, your contributions, your full participation are all necessary for completion of the work. So much so that when you're absent, right, it brings about this lack of completion, this lack of true connection. And as we celebrate 50 years, of our achievements, as we celebrate where we've come or how far we've come, I believe it's also important that we acknowledge that we have inherited a field that lacks completion. We've inherited a field that lacks true connection because for so long, the stewards of opera, the leaders of opera, have sent a message to people of color that we do not belong, not as leaders, not as artists, not as patrons, right? We do not belong outside of roles that have been dictated to us. We do not belong outside of roles in which our culture and our experiences are used for entertainment or prioritized for shallow initiatives that represent a self-serving commitment to diversity, right? While still centering whiteness. And I believe that while we have inherited this, it is our current overall unwillingness to get to the root of the issue, right? To get to the root of the fallacy of a racial hierarchy, the fallacy of white supremacy that allows us to continue operating in this exclusive pattern that continues to poison our field, that continues to ensure that we lack connection because the people who belong are not in the space. I believe we have to pay attention to what we want others to inherit, and the field must create and stand upon an unwavering resolve to bring about true change. We have to commit to leaning into courage as opposed to preserving our comfort. We have to commit to presenting humility rather than extending our expertise. We have to commit to sharing power over giving permission, and we must commit to centering truth and connection over upholding our own traditions. For me, that's what it means to belong in a space, to be in a space where I'm supposed to be, and that's what it means to create real belonging. Thank you.
Thank you, Quo. What a great way to get us started. And we'll certainly be digging into some of those areas as we go along. Especially, I love your idea about lacking completion. And so then what does that look like? And what do we gain by being complete and being whole? Next, we'll go to Huang for his thoughts. Okay, and we're going to wait until Huang's microphone gets back on. So we'll come back to you, Huang, as we work through the sound here. We certainly want to hear what you have to say. So we'll jump over to Mark, if that's all right. Mark, we'll put you up front soon.
Awesome. Hey, good morning, everybody. Hello, and thank you, Opera America, for the opportunity to participate in this session. Especially want to thank Nina for her remarks and Alejandra for providing a framework for our conversation. This past Monday, a Black man named George Floyd was killed by a police officer in Minneapolis while pleading for help, saying he can't breathe. At the same time, in New York Central Park, a white woman was calling the police to report a Black man claiming he was threatening her life simply because he asked her to put her dog on a leash. I want to be mindful that our conversation is taking place within this larger context. And within that context, talking about how we can create authentic belonging for non-white people at our organizations feels somewhat trivial and yet so very, very urgent. Urgent because if we cannot do this here, where the art is universal and the work is grounded in beauty and discovery, and the results can be transcendent and healing, in other words, reflective of all that is good. If we cannot do that here, then what chance do we have when it comes to things like schools, jobs, housing, or policing? Why is this so elusive for us? Nina offered concrete steps you could take, so I'll refer you to that presentation, and to it, I'll add 3 more points for your consideration. 1, we have to change the equation so that we are not at the center. Too often, our efforts to serve and work with non-white people are centered on our needs. We set the terms for the offer, and the others can accept it or not. But belonging requires a give and take with those who should and want to be there. It's what we mean by co-creation. In Nina's succinct and brilliant of, by, for thinking, we might consider this to be with. It's giving agency to those you want to engage with, to help shape the how and why of that engagement. It's the same spirit that drives the rallying cry often heard within the disabilities movement, nothing about us without us. 2, one of our biggest obstacles when trying to engage non-white audiences is fear. Not fear for our safety or well-being, but a fear to listen. A fear that if we ask someone what they need, we will then be obliged to respond. And we're afraid that the response will require changing our practices and programming in ways that we don't want to or are unable to. And so we just don't ask. We are in a moment of pause caused by the pandemic restrictions. Maybe we can take this time to ask, making only the promise to listen. Ask us, what do you dream of? What brings you joy? Where do you hurt? Can I be of help? And as we build trust and build relationships, we create the conditions for co-creation so that any changes that come from this will be created together. And number three, can we strengthen our ability to talk about and understand the complex dynamics of race? There are fantastic organizations like the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond who offer great services and workshops that can help in this regard. Good intentions are fine, but they require humility and work. The Australian Aboriginal activist Lila Watson said, "If you have come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound with mine, then let us work together. Non-white people, we don't want your charity or salvation. We need your solidarity. Stand next to me. Let us be and stay proximate with one another. Not just on opening night. Only then can you and I truly belong in the same space." Thanks for this opportunity.
Thank you, Mark. And that's such an important point about continuing with this and the importance, right? I think one of the questions that we'll definitely be talking about is, do we feel that this is important, right? Getting back to Nina's question about not just who matters, but also adding the what matters. And do we feel that this is important right now to dig in and to join in solidarity? So thank you so much. We will move on to Ryan for his thoughts and comments.
Thank you, Alejandra. Much like Mark, because the really heinous incident with George Floyd has happened in my hometown, I've been shocked and a little bit out of sorts, trying to figure out what an appropriate personal and artistic response might be, so that we have this as a moment that we learn and can change the lives of the folks in our community in a positive way. And as a singer and a swimmer, I think part of what shocked me so much was the words that George spoke, "I can't breathe." And I've been thinking as I do home workouts and walks in the parks here in Minnesota, how much we take for granted the ability to breathe and breathe deeply and breathe freely. And as I sort of juxtaposed that thought process with the idea of belonging, I think my great hope is to be able to work in an institution and an industry that encourages the ability of everyone who chooses to interact with us to be able to breathe deeply and fully in who they are and in their experience as they interact with the art form. And so that has been really where my brain has been focused in the last few days. And I've been reflecting on how extraordinary it's been to work for an institution where before I was hired, our board as a governing body had expressed their interest in creating a better space of belonging for our art form within the Twin Cities. There are many of my colleagues who are having to partner with their boards and help pull them into this conversation because we have such systemic habit about how we approach production and fundraising and marketing and audience building and development. And I sit in a place of extraordinary privilege because my board directed me to do this work and to help the company lead this work as we move forward. And at the same time, although I will say that it's never an easy path, the journey that we have been on has allowed for my staff to be incredible instructors for those of us who are at the leadership level and the board level. And the way in which we've set this conversation in action has taught me a lot in this moment. And so I would just say, as we continue the journey and continue the conversation, that part of what is important is not dealing in the mental space that Nina calls us to hold to really think about strategy in a moment of crisis for the sake of doing the work. It's thinking about the outcome and thinking about how much better we will all be able to breathe deeply and fully together as a result of the effort that we take incrementally in order to make the work stronger and more beautiful.
Thank you, Ryan, so much for sharing your thoughts, and especially as you are in the space where that kind of racial conflict and tragedy is actively happening, which we know does happen widely, unfortunately, in our country. I want to kick it back to Huang here and see if we can't hear from him next.
Can you hear me now? Okay.
Yes, we can.
Now I feel belong again. I'm sorry. I was like, pull it out. Anyway, it's how should I say? To me, belonging feels is part of my home. I'm part of the family, and also is my duty to to participate. I don't want to be, how should I say, like in the movie Matrix. I remember there was a scene that the key keeper is the Asian, or the guy who who do the accounting. But what about the host? What about the people who live in the house? Can they also be us? Any of us? So my journey came from, my background was a symphonic composer first before I start writing opera. I often found my music to be grouped as Asian Composers Concert or Asian American Composers Night, this or that. And one of the reasons I decided to write for opera was thinking, if I create an opera, I hope there's no opera season, is only Asian composers, Asian American composers opera season, which could be interesting. So then I started writing opera to my, and then I suddenly realized that there's not too many operas sung in Chinese, first of all. Secondly, there are not too many operas is about, Chinese American subjects or issues that we are dealing with today or in the past as a community and society. So I intentionally wanted to create operas that related to me, tells our story that I feel part of. So my first opera, I created an opera called Dr. Sun and Sen, is sung in Chinese. And I wrote An American Soldier with David Henry Huang, which dealt with the very, very issue of racism and being who got to be an American and what does being American mean. So being in the world of pandemic, we are here. I was just participating in a panel talk of New York Historical Society. They have this exhibition called Asian American Exclusion and Inclusion. That was several years ago. And when we do this talk again, just a few days ago, we changed the topic to Asian American inclusion and exclusion. So in a way, it mirrors how Asian American were treated because of certain idea of the pandemic that associate with Asian American people. I personally has experience of wearing masks and being treated differently. So I think art always related to life, and we are talking today not just about the past, not just about present, but also it's about the future. So that's what we are here about. Thank you.
Thank you, Huang, for sharing all of that. I'm glad that we were able to get your voice as part of this, for sure, and look forward to digging into this concept too of, right, if art is to replicate and to show our life now as we live it, boy, we're missing a really big part of it if we're only focusing on the same white-centric stories over and over again. So looking forward to digging into some of that as we move along. Next, we'll hear from the wonderful Teresa Ruth Howard and have her share her thoughts.
Thank you for having me as the outlier from the ballet world. But the field has been doing a lot of work. And so I hope to share with you some of my learnings from that and some of my experience as a ballet dancer and this concept of belonging. And so as a writer, I like to go to the actual definitions of words, because I think that oftentimes they're elastic and they're mutable, and we're using a word and we think we're saying and meaning the same thing, and oftentimes we're not. And what jumped out to me about belonging specifically is the idea that one of the definitions of it is a sense of home. And so ideally, we think of home as a place where we are formed, where it's our first space of learning. It's a safe space where we are encouraged to take risks, and where we are loved in spite of ourselves, oftentimes. But what does that mean in terms of what the field of opera might mean? What does it mean to be at home in opera? And for me, it would begin with having a seat at the table, being seen, but more importantly, being heard and considered, and not just as a gesture of generosity or charity, but equality. It means being represented, but representation is also one of those tricky words that gets misconstrued. So if I want to open up the idea of representation in terms of the analogy home, to me, that means it's a place where you eat food with flavors you recognize, you tell stories in your own tongue or dialect that's innate and organic. That representation begets belonging, means that sometimes you don't need words for explanation, that it's just unspoken because we get it. And the true sense of belonging means that you don't need a code because you don't need to switch, right? And so there's this idea that to be authentic, to be the unabridged version of yourself, that you can come with your mask down and be safe and protected in that space, is the idea of what belonging in representation in opera would mean to me. But I think that we might be jumping ahead of ourselves, because I think that opera can't authentically get to the idea of being a space of belonging if it's unwilling to interrogate itself, right? Interrogate the culture and identify the pillars and the values that spring and prop up systematic and institutional racism, right? So if we're unwilling to look at that and decide if we're ready to get rid of some of that stuff as we rebuild, then we're not going to get to belonging, right? And I mean, I have my head is exploding because I have so much. Nina, thank you for your talk, because the idea that we always want to get to ticking boxes and tasks and things like this, but we very seldom talk about reflection. And we can't get to this work unless we're really honest about what we're actually dealing with, right? And so part of belonging is an element of trust. And we have to be honest that the world that we live in, people of color historically have a problem, and rightfully so, with trusting communities of whiteness. Right? Even when you're inviting us in and saying, come and belong, usually there's an ulterior motive. We have to ask, why? Why are we seeking belonging? What's the intention? Your methodology is dictated by your motivation. And ballet talks about it, opera talks about the idea that we have to stay relevant and that we have to keep audiences. And before opera can really talk about belonging, then you have to say, are those the right reasons that we're seeking belonging? and inclusion. And I'll leave it there for now. But that's where my mind goes when we talk about belonging.
That's great. Thanks, Teresa. And I mean, that was also the first step, right, in what Nina laid out. The first one is an assessment. It was not surprising, sadly, the findings from Nina's organization about where folks wanted to be and where they actually thought they were, right? So I think that's a really critical first step, and a hard one. It also speaks to, you also spoke a little bit to Mark's comment around setting terms for the offer, right? Yes, we want you to belong and included, but it's on our terms because we need to check the box, because we need to get new audiences, you know, as opposed to really understanding, getting to a better why. Maybe it's asking that why question 5 times. Next, we'll go to Nina. Nina, you already gave 30 minutes of your thoughts on belonging. So it seems almost cruel to make you go back to that. But I do want to make sure that we hear from you, either as a response to what you've heard from our panelists in their remarks, or just some additional thoughts that have come up for you since recording that talk.
Thank you. And I'm just so honored and really energized by what I've just heard, and just grateful to be in this conversation space. And I think that I'll speak as a white person to white people who are listening, and really invite you to think about what you want to transform during this time and what you want to unlearn. And I think everybody in some ways has just now spoken about the extent to which we're working and living within a system of systemic racism. And it doesn't mean you have to identify yourself as a racist to identify the ways that you're acting within that system. And I really believe that this crisis gives us the opportunity to decide, are we going to lean into our desire to radically transform white supremacist systems, or are we just hoping to get people back in those seats and get our balance sheet back in order? And I think that the decisions we make now, what we commit to, and what we are willing to unlearn is going to dictate not just to ourselves, but to our audiences and our patrons, who we are and what we're about. So I would really invite you to think about what you're ready to unlearn. I saw in the chat somebody asked about, you know, how do we start to share power? And I'll just share from my own experience that one of the most challenging things about belonging that I had to deal with when I was a museum director was I got quite confused when we started to have success really inviting people who had not been traditional museum goers to participate. Some of our traditional museum goers started to complain. It's too loud here. Why are these teenagers here? This furniture you got is junky. And at that moment, I actually had this confusion of, wait a second, if what we're trying to do is create a belonging space for everybody in our community, or an inclusive space for everybody in our community, does this, you know, typically like 75-year-old white person's opinion and their discomfort, is it equivalent in some way? How do I negotiate this? And for me, one of the things that's been incredibly powerful is thinking about power mapping and learning to ask myself the question, who's furthest from power in this situation, and how can I choose to prioritize their sense of belonging over somebody who might have more power? And I think that, you know, we've seen this very viscerally in what happened in Central Park with Christian Cooper and Amy Cooper, where a white woman's discomfort and sense of fear created a space of violence and true unsafety for the Black man who was there bird watching. And I think that it's one of those things where, for me, I started to get more activist and more able to think about what true belonging looked like when I started to think about it in the context of institutional racism and in the context of these power structures. And I was no longer deciding, do I care about that older white lady or do I care about this young teenager of color? Instead, I was asking myself, who is furthest from power? Who do I want to do the most work with? Who do I want to unlearn my existing practices with to create a sense of belonging? And how can I turn to that older lady and say, you know what? You don't own this whole space, and your discomfort doesn't get to exclude somebody else from feeling like they can walk in this space. One thing I think we have to learn as white people is that our comfort is not primary. It's not the reason the cops exist. It's not the reason our organizations exist. And if we can unlearn the idea that our comfort matters more than a person of color's safety, then we can start to talk about how we build those relationships that move us to being in real conversations that are not about exploitation and reproducing institutional trauma, but are about creating the kind of relationships that can bring us to the table, to eat the foods with the flavors that matter to us, to speak in the languages and in the ways we want to, and to take our masks down with a feeling of safety and comfort and enthusiasm about who else is at the table.
Thank you, Nina. That's such a really beautiful and eloquent way to talk about how to, about that power hierarchy, right? And how we can change that and start to let go of our traditional ways of doing things, let go of our own feeling of power, to start to create these spaces of real belonging. You know, I thought we'd open up this conversation really doing this beautiful, bright, forward-looking, what is the future? But I'm gonna change that a little bit because we've started to really dig into this assessment piece, right? Of what is it that we need to learn and have to learn. And so, you know, I wanna start us off with a question, and actually, Teresa, you and I had this conversation around, you know, have we learned enough already? Has our industry learned enough already to be able to carry us through our current moment of this pandemic and of this COVID crisis, right? Have we already learned enough to move forward without fear, to take brave steps, and to really challenge these racist systems, these norms that we've been a part of and been operating in? And so I want to start us off there. And Ryan, I'm going to put you on the spot, if that's okay with you, as a leader of an organization who has been doing a lot of this work. So I mean, I think you're really poised in a great place to answer this, both as the leader of your organization and then also industry-wide.
So what I would tell you is that I can't speak for the industry. I think that's a dangerous precedent for me to enter into in my position. But I can say that in answer to the question, have we learned enough? No. Have we, and that's uncomfortable, but I think what we have learned, at least with our organization, is that we have all of the tools we need if we are willing to take advantage of them. We have systems that we've set up where we know to question with an honest and open sense of curiosity, are we answering the right questions? Because I think sometimes in crisis, we jump to that moment of fixing something without talking about what should be fixed. Thank you for the finger, Teresa. I really appreciate that. And I have a staff and a board who has this uncanny knack of acknowledging whether we are answering the wrong questions and how do we identify what questions we need to be answering and who is best suited to answer those questions. Because sometimes it's people that are not in the room with us. And so I think, have we learned enough? No. But am I confident that we have the tools available to us to be able to continue to guide our journey forward? Yes, I feel like if we are willing and approach this work with an open mind and heart, then we have the tools we need to continue that learning and get us through.
Yeah, and Nadej, who is your current president of the Board of Trustees, or incoming president of the Board of Trustees, she posed a question comment during the opening panel, really, that was around this question of who is the future for, but really who are the decision makers who are going to be left in making those decisions. And so it's really wonderful to hear you, Ryan, talk about understanding that the people, if the person who can best answer that question is not in the room, how you bring them into the space. And Quo, I want to bring it back to you with your opening comments too around that, right? You talked about this incompleteness. Is that a word? It is now, right? This lack of being complete because we're not fully embracing all of those voices. So I wanted to give you some space to share out more in that, especially in the context of this question.
Yes, thank you. In looking at what in context for complete, it's not a matter of perfection. It is a matter of having everything we need so that we can continue a fluid journey, a fluid pattern of working together, of give and take, of humility, of what it means to learn about ourselves, to learn about others, what it means to include truth at the center. So that is what I say when I mean complete. Not so much as make sure you have a checkbox, right? As I always say, you can't treat people like Pokemon. You cannot go and catch them all, but make sure that as you are including those voices, that is the completion, that is that wholeness that you're looking for, and knowing that that will continue to morph throughout your work, because the service that we provide for others, what our art means for others, that will continue to morph, but we want to make sure that we're doing so as holistically as possible. So that's what I mean when I say completion.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much for adding some more color to that. As part of this conversation, I think in terms of have we learned enough as we move forward? Nina, I was taken during your comment in your presentation around this question of do you double down on the folks who already feel a sense of belonging? And why would you? At least that's what I heard. Probably not what you said. But I think it's true, right? I think especially right now in this moment of, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? And it's a real fear. I'm not taking that fear away of the crisis that our organizations are in or that artists are in. But what do we lose when we double down on, we're just going to focus on the people who we're already committed to, and then what do we gain by opening that up? And this is a question really for all of you to chime in with, and about, what is at stake when we do something like that?
So I'll start just by saying one of the ways I think about this a lot is in terms of promises. What are the promises, implicit or explicit, that we're making to people, and are we living up to those promises? And one of the organizations that's been inspiring me most right now is this theater company in the UK called Slung Low. They're a grassroots, very innovative theater company, and they realized that the assets they had around being great at bringing people together to put on a show could be deployed in a very different way. And they actually became the contracted NGO or nonprofit in their city to run the coronavirus hotline and relief effort. And so all the skills and assets they had around bringing people together to make something big and beautiful are being used to make food distribution and supplies and to help people find their lost cats. And they're also doing some creative work with their community around people sending in images that they're then printing and putting on telephone poles. And the reason I bring up this story is Alan Lane, who's their artistic director, has spoken very beautifully about asking, what is our theater company for? And what are we for right now? And he said, fundamentally right now, we're not for selling tickets. We're not for selling beer. He said, fundamentally, we are an organization that tells big stories and then tries to make them true in the world. And he said, the big stories we're committed to are the story that our community is all connected, and that's why we're doing this relief. And there's a story that everybody has something creative to share, and that's why we're doing these posters on telephone poles. And so when you think about this question of what do you lose, no question, I think, boy, do you lose a lot if you're not spending this time trying to cultivate relationships that lead to a future you want to build. But even on a deeper level, if you think about, if you're focused on holding tight to those you've had, and that's not your purpose, that's not what you exist to do, then you're losing your creative energy, you're losing your spirit, and you're losing the ability to kind of make a bold proposal about what comes next. And so I really think that we have some agency to think both about who are the people who matter most to us, who we want to move forward with, but also to think about what do we fundamentally exist to do, and how do we not violate our own values and our own purpose by doing something else because we feel threatened. And that threat can feel very real, but I would suggest that we will feel best waking up in the morning if we can spend this time doing something that feels very core to our purpose and doing it with people who we have always wanted to spend time with, but for one reason or another, I have my own interpretation about whether we chose to do that or not, but who we weren't doing so with in the past. So I think that there's a very hopeful spirit to the opportunity to choose to change and to choose to make promises that speak to your values, that connect you in relationship, and promises that you're not going to break.
Mark, you talked a little bit too about that pause and using that as an opportunity. Love to hear some thoughts from you based on what Nina just shared out and how we take this pause for that.
Yeah, I love that idea that you posited, Nina, that how do you turn the burden of this COVID-19 pandemic into a gift, and thinking about the gift that we've been presented with and the gift to reflect, as Teresa was saying, or the gift to experiment, as you suggested. And I'm really struck by that question of what do we exist to do? What is our purpose? What are we in the, why are we here, as organizations? And I think it's more than just to present opera. Like, I think we serve a bigger purpose in our communities than the work that we mount. And I talked about like the healing, the transcendence, the joy that comes from the experience of making art or experiencing the art, and all of that. I think about that in relation to our health, and that we are healthier when we're happy. We're healthier when the stress levels go down. We're healthier when we get to share a story, and we have the opportunity to do as that company in the UK is doing, to really use these resources, these assets for greater purpose, which does not exclude doing opera at all. Like, please keep doing opera, we need it, but towards what? Answering that question, I think it's a good time to now's a good time to ask that question.
Yeah, and we were prompted at the start of the conference by a panel that was taking apart the Glenn Ross quote, which I was excited by because we have it in the lobby at the Opera Center at Seattle Opera, and it's something. It was also a little sad because it was something that I always looked at on the way in, and just a nice way to kind of anchor me in my work. But I really wanted us to look towards a specific part of that quote of we must be oriented toward the future. And as I mentioned earlier, Nadej, one of the panelists, really asked us, well, whose future? And so, coming off of your statement, Mark, if we're going to take this moment now to look forward, to see what we can be and what we can become, I'd love to hear from all of you about what does an inclusive future for people of color in opera look like? And Hwang, I'd actually like to start with you because your statements were leading towards that too. It may or may not look like a full season of operas written by Chinese composers, but what does that mean to you as you're thinking ahead of what does the future look like, and whose future are we talking about?
I think it goes to the first very fundamental question we should ask is what is the function of art, or what's the function of opera first? Is art supposed to be reactive, or art supposed to lead? So I think once we could answer that question first, then we can see what our future is. Now, we have seen great art created, no matter opera or theater or other art form, dance and symphonic works, reacted to things happen to our life, for good things or bad things. And that's the part of the nature of art does. But I also do believe art is not just entertainment. it does serve a function. And for those of us so fortunate enough to hold the keys to the art form, to be able to produce, create, and to lead. So what can art take people to the place, the next stage, the next step? So hopefully the people is an inclusive group, not just one type or two, but everybody, created by a very diverse group of people. So yes, so I think number one, art can lead. So instead of just, let's say, we discover our community has blooming residents of one minority group, then we should create this kind of opera to go to outreach to them, to tell their story so that we fulfill a check mark of we are being diverse. To me, yes, that's a very good first step, but that's not the only step, and it's definitely far away from where the future is for. So as an artist myself, as a creator for opera, I want to see an opera that, you know, can be performed on the stage or on the season of any other composers, not to be pigeonholed as one type or one group of audience only. Ultimately, we do want to have a diverse audience to attend opera, but before doing so, we do need to have operas that is created for that purpose first.
Can I make an observation?
Yes.
This is really, really fascinating, because invariably, whenever we have these conversations, we always go to this really abstract place that takes it outside of ourselves. We're talking about art as if it's this thing. We talk about organizations as if they're these things. And as if they're not, like, art does not exclude, people exclude, right? And so, like, organizations are people. These are systems that we're not talking about the system. We like to put it in this abstract thing as if it's something that we can't control and we're not responsible for. And that's inherently problematic. And that's why we can't move forward. That's why it becomes a box ticking thing, because inherently we're not talking about us. We're talking about something over there. And that's the fearful thing. And that makes me, Nina, I want to go to the idea of comfort and discomfort. You know, comfort is really a byproduct of privilege, right? When you live in a body of color, your natural state is almost one of discomfort or dis-ease, right? You're always like sort of on alert. And so, like, when I hear those words, I understand what they mean, actual definitions, but how that's embodied is very different. And so I would encourage us to, and I agree with everything that's been said about art, but is that what opera is really trying to do? Opera, not the art of opera, but the system of opera. Is that what it is trying to do? It's very pointed in the stories that it tells and whose stories they tell, just like ballet is, right? And over the eras that changes, but who has that voice has always pretty much been the same. And so I think that's what comes up for me. And also, I think it's interesting that systems of oppression are sciences. It's a science. When in South Africa, when they were looking for a system, like, what system of oppression should we do? They designed it. They studied systems of oppression and then put together the elements of it that would create the perfect system. But we're not studying the dismantling of those systems in the same way. We want to get to it, just get it over with. We're past this, we're ready, let's go. And for people of color, it is dismissive, because it means that you're not taking what this experience is and has been seriously enough to give it its due, right? Reparations aren't just like 40 acres and a mule. And we're seeing that. And so I think we have to be really careful, because the idea that someone can extend belongingness, is that a word?
It is now.
It is also a privilege. And so, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's I think a great segue for us to get into, and y'all just unmute yourselves, just jump in on this. I think it's a great opportunity for us to get into, okay, so, we're going through this assessment process. We are going through this moment of pause. What is it that we have to put aside? What do we need to stop doing right now? And what are the things that we need to be looking at to change, to really create the change that is needed both internally, culturally, to move us forward in the future that we want us to be in?
Could I just say one thing first? Just came to my mind about the future after the pandemic. Knock on wood, that is sooner rather than later to arrive. Well, what I could foresee kind of is, unfortunately, our organizations will be in a more, unstable ground financially. And yes, our society could turn into more diverse, more divided, excuse me. So one thing I thought to ask is, as in that scenario, is maybe some organizations, opera companies, they will play it safe. They need to program the big ticket sellers to bring back the audience to make ticket incomes, and opera with diversity purpose or more adventures, unfortunately, might be put aside or put delayed or be in a very disadvantaged position. But of course, if we talk about how to bring in people to create diversity to continue this topic, then just by programming Puccini is not able to do that or not able to do so. So then you are in this paradox of how can we combine those two while not losing the ability to focus on our cause, but also at the same time not bankrupt the company. So I think that's realistically would be something we can talk about as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. Quo.
If I may, I would say that it is important for what we do right now that we look at our history. Right? Teresa spoke about it. We have to internalize this. This is not an option. It's not an option for me, not in the way I live. It's not an option for a lot of people. The issue is that it is an option for a lot of our leaders. And so we have to internalize this. We have to make this a part of what we do for opera. We have to center community. We have to center accountability. And then we have to go and examine thyself, right? We need to go and we need to examine the work that we do and why. We have to examine our own biases. We have to go through that process. Otherwise, we just become more efficient in supporting the system that we're in. So much so that we will cling to it as we try to make it out of this pandemic. And so much so that we will avoid actually having conversations that need to be had. Conversations are uncomfortable, but in a lot of cases, they don't cost a lot of money, right? But in doing so, you do have to put in the work. You have to do the work. And this is the heart's work, right? This is the hard work and this is the heart's work. And if you want to ensure that opera means something, we want to ensure that opera means something, we don't get to dictate to others what it means. We don't get to dictate why you should appreciate this Puccini. If I said I don't like it because of things, right? Then that's room for a conversation. Not, oh, I need you to educate me on why this is. No, I said, or no, I am dealing with these things and I'd like to see something that is more relevant in addition to the Puccini. I love Puccini, don't get me wrong. But it is a matter of accountability. It is a matter of responsibility. And as Teresa said, it is a matter of understanding that your comfort is a privilege. So what does it mean when you decide to stand side by side, like Mark said, when you decide to stand side by side with someone else who's dealing with something differently, who is experiencing it differently? What does it mean when you take yourself out of the center, take your privilege out of the center, take your advantage out of the center so that you can move along with others? That is what our organizations need to consider now, because it is the organizations that serve the community that will make it out of this pandemic.
could not agree with you more, Quo, especially around that idea of assigning value, right? And who gets to assign it? And do we have, are we allowed to be upset when somebody doesn't value what we value the same way? And the why. Mark and Teresa, I think you looked like you had wanted something to share. I'll give you the floor here.
No, I mean, I just these are really great, and thinking about just operas, and in this moment of tremendous loss, and I want to hear those songs of pain. I want to hear the sound that reflects what is going on, and I don't want to go into the opera house to do it. I want to hear it on my street corner so I can walk to it. Kill it, Nina, kill it. If you start flying away, we'll send help. But I want to hear it here because the pain is here, because the need is here. And I feel like in this moment of how we're going to come back post I don't know, sequestering, like I want to see that.
Yeah, well, I think that speaks to redefining, right, what the art form looks like and is presented. And for me, at least, that's something that comes up when we talk about creating something with communities of color, is oftentimes what we're talking about might look a little different than what you're used to seeing every day. And we have to be okay with that. And it's really uncomfortable. And I've seen people get really squirmy about, I'm sorry, you want us to do what? You know, even something as simple as like, we got to start late, folks. This thing isn't going to start on time, because that's the norm of the folks that we're inviting in, right? So I think for me, a lot of that is around reimagining what does opera look like? What is it when we start really creating it as a place of belonging for communities and people of color who are, you know, who we're asking to be a part of this. Teresa, I'll turn that over to you.
Nina, are you okay? Is that one of those? In your presentation, I thought what was really interesting was the Dia de las Muertes. I probably murdered that, right? And the idea that what came to me is that the process was that you brought people into the museum by taking them out of the museum. Right. And so the idea of that these forms take place in very specific places that feel like barriers, right? That are intimidating in certain ways, that don't feel familiar to certain types of people. And that's, you know, race aside, that's class as well. Might be another way that opera in terms of moving forward, the future of it. What does that mean? Carlos Acosta, who just took over the Birmingham Royal Ballet, is thinking about putting Swan Lake on a barge in one of the rivers, right? So now the proscenium is gone, which is actually, Swan Lake is great because it'll take place on a lake. But the idea that it now creates access in a very, very different way. And it feels like people can enter it. And maybe that's part of what opera might look towards in terms of like, instead of always trying to get people to come to us, that we actually go to them. And I do not mean in outreach capacity.
Yep. Yeah, but with humility. Yeah, you know, I think even what Alejandra just shared about, you know, what time does it start? It all starts from really being curious about, for a community that really matters to you, what do spaces and experiences of belonging feel like? That's actually another one we heard. I remember always talking to this Latina mom who said to me, you know, the events at the museum are very nice, but these white events, they always start at a particular time and end at a particular time. I feel like I need to be there the whole time. I feel awkward if I leave early. And, you know, I think that there is a difference between hearing those kinds of pieces of input or feedback and then choosing whether you're going to act on them or not, and choosing whether you're going to change the way you program, where you program, how you program, to be in accordance with what somebody's saying. For me, a space of belonging, of comfort, of safety, of enjoyment, of pleasure looks like this. And I think that, you know, I just keep coming back to, Teresa, what you said earlier was just powerful and brilliant. And it made me think to the question, Alejandra, you asked about, do we have the tools? You know, I don't know anything about opera, but I'll say, as a white person who's been working in a space that's around inclusion and anti-racism for a while, I feel like I still don't have those tools to the extent that I need to, or that I'm not leaning into and using them every day. And I think about, you know, with Of By For All, we did a workshop with some members of our network, just inviting them to interrogate the history of how their organization got founded. And there were so many people who, for the first time, were starting to imagine, oh, there might be trauma for some folks in the fact that this was built by people who were enslaved, or there might be trauma based on the fact that there was a time when this library was, you know, was segregated. And I think that another luxury of whiteness, like, you know, the comfort privilege thing, is the sense that, you know, the white story is the neutral story. And I think that one thing we can do as part of this unlearning during this time is to learn some about our own legacy, and then figure out, how am I going to really, as Kwa was saying, be accountable to that so that we can move forward. I mean, you know, there's a museum we're working with, a major museum that was working, said, we want to get closer to the African diaspora communities in our city. And they said, one of the first things we realized was we had an exhibition 40 years ago of African artifacts in a way that was very exploitative, treated as anthropological objects, da, 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 da. And they said, you know, none of us were on staff at that time. And the community leaders who we're working with now were not necessarily in our city. But the first thing we had to do was to acknowledge and be accountable to that history internally with our own team and with those partners. And we could not start a conversation without doing that, because otherwise it's built on this false basis of past trauma. And that contributes to that unsafety. And so I'm just thinking very viscerally about, you know, Teresa, to the challenge you put out about how are we embodying the choice to do this work, quote, to some of what you're saying about, hey, it may not be easy, but the conversation's important, you know, so how do we push ourselves into using those tools? Maybe we have all of them, but I certainly don't feel like I'm being called as a white person every day to use them or to interrogate them to the best of my ability. And I think there's an opportunity for us to do that now.
Yeah. So when it comes to tools, I think we do have the tools. What came to me was, what's your skill level with that tool? Like, I know how to use a drill. I have a drill, but my skill level with that drill is very limited. Right? So I think that like, that's where we get blocked. You know, like where we think that oh, well, I've got it. I know how to work this forklift. And you're like, oh, no, you really don't. So the other thing that Nina was interesting to me was the idea that you gave the celebration to the community, right? And oftentimes, like, instead of like white splaining what this event, what this means to them, right? Doing the interpretation or translating it for them, which was, let's call that old school. Let's hope that it's old school. We have this conversation around like, what stories should we tell? Who should tell those stories? And things like that. But I it's always to a degree, right? So we can have like in Ballet, we'll have, oh, the choreographer gets to be Black, but everybody else on the team is white, right? And so a radical thing would be something that's happening, something like what's happening in Hollywood around Black film and Black television, where you're getting the full 360, cultural experience of how people in this community would make this thing carte blanche, in the totality, right? So that you have a cinematographer that is from his cultural perspective, and a writer and actors, and it's a very different product. But very seldom does that get to happen. And that's what I mean by, is opera really ready to really invite people in with a sense of belonging, because then you don't get to control everything or hold power, that you get the power of the veto. And I'm just asking a question. I asked the question of ballet too, and it's something that you need to sit back and think about for a minute.
Well, I think it's part of that assessment process, right? It's part of really taking that critical look at yourself and at your work. Teresa, you've mentioned the quote. Nina, I mean, you've all mentioned this. It's part of that assessment process. Are you really ready to do this? And you can't just kind of do it. That's not going to work anymore. I think at least I have some faith that we're past that point of like, we're going to call you out if you try and do it halfway. So either say you're going to do it and do it, or just hang back a little bit. Ryan, I wanted to invite you to share out your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I think one of there are two things that I've been learning and sort of been trying to actively engage with. One is actually providing and holding space for artists of color who are working in the industry to teach us, because there are roles and opportunities in operatic development that are becoming more regular, but the diversity within those stories, because each demographic isn't homogenous. Each community isn't homogenous. So to hear from the artists who are actively working in the field, and I'm blessed to have a staff that many of us are former singers, but to hear from artists actively working who are people of color about the types of roles that they would like to interact with, the types of stories they would like to tell, and having that be part of the conversation with your staff, which is difficult because typically we run, one of our systems is to run very tight operations in order to reduce expense. So our exposure to the artists while they are visiting with us is limited. But we are now creating space to have conversations between staff and artists while they are with us. And if it means extending the rehearsal process a couple days, or if it means taking rehearsal time out of the room to create space for those conversations to happen, I think that's important. And we're learning a lot from what those artists are sharing with us while they're visiting Minnesota Opera about the types of dreams and hopes that they have as creators. The other thing too, just as we're talking about leadership, which is still predominantly white, is that one of the great things I've learned from some of my mentors who are in and out of our field is we process as leaders very quickly, and we have to make quick decisions. And if we rely on instinct, a lot of our instincts are based on these systematic habits of oppression and racism. And so in the moment, the minute you feel yourself saying, oh, well, that's going to create a problem because of X, or this creates an obstacle, or this is too difficult to solve, don't dismiss that, but rather ask yourself, what is this person teaching me? And assume that what they're telling you is the truth. Because sometimes I think we're too quick to jump to a space of believing they just don't understand how things work. And rather than saying, okay, here's a problem because it's different than what we normally do, and trusting that your staff and your artists can help you wrestle with that problem is an important switch. And so that's something that I'm not great at. And I am struggling with it every time I go into an important strategic meeting, but it is something that I'm really trying to actively put into place that I've picked up from others. And those are two important tools. But I think the biggest thing for me is let's not leave artists, and specifically artists of color, out of the conversation about the types of stories and creative experiences that we want to invest in the future.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Ryan, for sharing that with such humbleness and humility around that, because I think that's true. I mean, I certainly have heard that a lot, and I've probably been guilty of saying it too, of like, oh, well, you don't understand. And I've certainly gotten to like, oh, she just doesn't understand. But to take that pause and to invite in folks into that decision-making process can be really powerful. We are going to turn it over to some of the questions that have come in through the chat. And so Mark's going to join us to pose some of those questions for us.
Well,
Hi, Mark.
thanks so much. And thank you everyone for this incredibly honest and rich discussion. It's riveting, and I so appreciate it. There are a lot of questions. Alejandra, I'm so glad you brought up the question of what do you have to stop doing? So I think a lot of people get really burdened by, what do I have to start doing? I have too much to do. Maybe there are things you can stop doing. And at this time when we've almost erased the blackboard in this pause, what do we want to put back on the blackboard, on the chalkboard when we get there? So it's a wonderful opportunity to think about, what do we need to stop doing to reduce barriers? The question of motivation. I so know how members talk about building diversity in order to remain compliant with requirements from their state arts agency or local arts agency. I can't wait until we get to the day where diversity is because the art is better, the season is richer, and the lobby is more fun. So motivation, well, you can think about that. But two questions, and they're slightly interrelated. One, a couple of questioners, I think there's timidity about, how do I know if I'm doing the right thing, and how do I know if I'm doing it the right way? I want to get started, but I don't necessarily trust my instincts. I don't know that I've had the right advice, or that I've made the right decision. How do I know that I'm doing the right thing and that I'm doing it the right way? This is question number one. And the second question is, in order to allow people into the positions of power, it means they have to be hired. And Ryan, I think you've made some progress in setting up hiring policies and practices and for interviews and recruitment in Minnesota Opera, so that the many talented people who want to rise in our field have an opportunity to do so, because you're more thoughtful about your hiring process. So one about the hiring process, the other about, how do I know I'm doing the right thing and doing it the right way?
If I may, concerning how do you know you're doing the right thing? In my work, for racial equity work, there's always this assumption that you have to be perfect. You will never be doing the right thing. You will never be doing it the right way. There will always be somebody who will say, hey, I don't appreciate this, I don't appreciate that. You know that you're doing it correctly. You know that it is true when you're seeking truth, when you're doing so with humility, when you are looking for a human connection. This is what this is about, right? We're all here so that we can say that, hey, we're human beings too, stop locking us out. We're human beings too, stop assigning certain things to us. So once you kind of let go of that perfectionism, let go of the fact that you don't have to be perfect, you don't have to do it the right way, but you have to be honest about what you're doing. You have to create these connections. We have to create these connections. And then we have to be committed to it, knowing that it's not going to be easy and it's not going to be simple. You won't get the answers you need maybe in the first, second, 50th engagement. But if you're committed to truly connecting with others, know that we see you, right? I see you, I hear you. Know that as we work together, that it will be done together, but you have to start somewhere. And do not allow, I want to be right, I want to be correct, to prevent you from actually stepping into something that is unknown, because that's not possible. Doesn't make sense. But it's okay, because we can get it together.
So Quo, as a follow-up, if I discover that I've made just a mistake, I've done that wrong, how do you back out of it? How do you repair?
There's no backing out. You don't back out of it because you're in it now. Right? Yeah. It's relationship building. And so in repairing, again, do so with humility, do so with honesty, come to someone else as a human being, strip yourself as best as possible of all the assumptions, all of the pre-described kind of notions that we've had about others and other communities. Come to someone as you are. Accept that person as you are, and then have conversations. Understand that the narratives that we are so used to hearing and that we've accepted are incorrect, right? They're half truths, which are lies. But we want to make sure that as we make mistakes, it's okay to make mistakes. Those mistakes should not be deadly. So many of us do face deadly mistakes. This is not a deadly mistake, right? This is not life or death in trying to connect with others. So we want to make sure that we kind of relieve ourselves of that weight of, oh no, I made a mistake. We're all going to make mistakes. And that we walk together, truly together, not in front, not behind, not voice with voiceless type thing, but truly walking together.
And I would add like the authenticity of your intention, plus education, plus humility, curiosity, and openness, right? You're going to be damned if you do and damned if you don't, because there's so much that has been wrong that, you know, it's like taking a drop of water and trying to make an ocean in the desert. And so the idea that your intention and the authenticity of that you bring that forth. You can make a mistake as long as you're clear about like, well, this is what I was trying to do. And you're open to taking the feedback, right? And that also means that you need to have people around you that make you uncomfortable. I always say that if you are talking to Black people that when you walk away, you feel really good, you're like, yes, I'm on it, then you're not talking to the right Black people. You're just not. Right? You should feel a little bit uncomfortable because you're in the learning, because it's that thing of like, I'm not quite sure, but I'm open to learning. And I think that people of color are very, very generous when it comes to mistakes being made. That doesn't mean that they're not going to be angry and irritated and pissed off, and they're not going to drag you on Twitter, because they will. It just means that when we see the effort, the authentic effort, we affirm that and we acknowledge that and we support it. So you can't be afraid. It's not for the faint of heart. It really is, like, your fragility is not going to serve you well here. You really have to go all in. And when you do that, these communities will embrace your attempt and your effort.
Thank you both for that. Ryan, the question about how you are adjusting, building out hiring recruitment practice that enables people to move up in your organization.
Yeah, I think it's sometimes about moving up and sometimes it's about finding new voices. But we don't have drastically different processes in terms of the interview process, but for us, it's more about asking ourselves if we have seen everyone from every perspective who might better serve this position. And in many cases, it has been about taking the time, which is precious, and I want to acknowledge that up front. It's not an easy choice to go into a search for us now, because we know the effort that will be required in order to seek candidates. We cannot post on the 4 channels that we were used to posting job opportunities, but we have to call people with personal connections with universities and organizations outside of our regular trajectory and actively seek and recruit. And that does take time and effort. And we just try and make sure that we have seen a diverse pool of applicants in person for every open position that we advertise publicly. There are internal promotions that are handled the same way that they were always handled. And as the staff becomes more diverse, we will see that continue through the organization, how those positions are fed. We are also taking an opportunity through our resident training program to create specific positions where people of color have not traditionally been able to find an outlet of that kind. So we have a new assistant technical director position within the resident program that is specifically designed for a person of color. Because if you go and look at the crews backstage in most theaters and in opera houses, it's pretty homogenous and it's pretty white. And so if we're going to influence that, let's find the next leaders of color who are in those positions, in the same way that I think Cincinnati Opera has invested in arts administrators of color. And I think each of our companies is starting to find ways to invest in that effort. But we're taking incremental steps to make that better. The only thing that I would add to the conversation about, am I doing the next right thing, is I agree completely with Quo and Teresa. It will never be the right thing. And I find it helpful to figure out exactly when you must make a decision, and it helps you figure out how much information you can gather so that you are confident that in that moment you are making the best decision possible with all of the information you can acquire. And then you have to forgive yourself when you make the mistakes and anticipate that they will happen. The new version of our charter, I think, actively states that we are not succeeding unless we are failing at some point on the journey. So that would be what I offered there.
And I'd just love to jump in just for a moment about this leadership piece. You know, the leaders we've had in our fields for a long time brought us to where we are now. And I think that if we want to go somewhere different, we have to think really differently about who the voices and who the leaders are who are going to make that happen. One of the worlds of white supremacy that I'd love to see us work on dismantling is how executive recruitment and how boards look for those top jobs. There are so many arts organizations in the next year that are going to struggle, maybe be on the verge of bankruptcy, maybe be ready for renewal. And I'm really curious, who are going to lead those organizations forward, and how do we really look differently for those roles at the top? Because I believe that, you know, the board and that executive leadership, that's where we need the most creativity, the most new thinking. And we need to be able to really look differently in the same way, Ryan, you're looking down throughout your organization. How do we do that at the top as well? I believe if we're going to build a stronger and a different kind of field, we need different kinds of leadership. And that means more people of color in leadership. And that means changing the way executive recruitment happens.
And you've both brought up this dismantling, right? I mean, Ryan, your example is so clear about that. What you've done through giving more time to the hiring process is dismantling that characteristic of white supremacy about time constraints, right? We don't have the time to do it, so we got to move on. Nina, the same thing in what you were saying as well. And so, you know, as we're wrapping up our conversation here, I do want to give everybody an opportunity to say, okay, so what's our call to action, right? What is that thing that you want to make sure that folks listening are going to do? And we'll kind of do this really fast because I'm getting the notice here that we got to wrap things up. But just, you know, what is that one thing that you want folks to really think about and to do as their next step, especially for those folks who are thinking, ooh, how do I move forward? And Huang, we'll start with you.
Well, I don't have an answer, but I just have one question for us to all think about is after this pandemic time, no doubt that people will be, you know, have a second thought to come out to see a live performance or come to the theater. So it's not just we are socially distancing, but also we are all isolating. So whatever project you are doing or we are doing or putting together, so to make everyone feel a belonging, and I think that would be something I would love to see, because just pretend nothing happened and go back to doing the happy, laughing, and same program, I just don't see that could happen in the short future.
Mark, would love to hear from you.
I think the opposite of love isn't hate, it's fear. And so I would just encourage us to lead with love, to not be afraid, to see the stranger, to welcome the stranger, to not let fear paralyze you from acting.
Excellent. Nina.
Listen to Quo, listen to Teresa, pay people who you're listening to about this stuff. And I would also, to this whole thing about mistakes, I would really offer that what we have been doing has led to us creating harm and us creating exclusion. And so if you make a mistake on your authentic path to try to change the way you're engaging, that means you're moving in the right direction. And I think that if you can get as sensitive to the harm you were doing by excluding or not engaging, and the mistakes that were existing there, you'll get a lot more open to the mistakes that you might be making as you go on a path to something else. Thank you so much for putting this panel together.
Thanks, Nina. Ryan, parting words from you?
I would just say that part of what I was struck with yesterday in watching Nina's talk was the evolution at her museum seemed, because it was a 30-minute talk, like all of that success and the growth that happened in 30 minutes. And so, and that gets to be a little too much to hold as a board member or a staff leader, or just a member of staff or an artist. So I would just encourage people to remember that the work is in fact incremental, and it's built by authentic caring and taking a little bit of time. It doesn't have to be an exorbitant amount of time, but one step will lead to the next. So find one way that you would like to interact and change something about your pattern or your company's pattern, and begin there, because starting somewhere is better than freezing.
Excellent. Teresa.
Yeah, so I was thinking about the hiring piece. And what struck me was that oftentimes white people can see the potential in other white people and higher potential, that they don't have to come fully formed. And yet people of color oftentimes have to be twice as good, overqualified, and yada, 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 before they're given an opportunity. And they're seen as a risk. So I would say, you know, check your implicit bias in that regard, in terms of like, you know, I would say for dance companies, you don't have to hire a dancer that is equal to your principal dancer. They just have to be better than the weakest person in your core. Think about that for a second. While you're thinking about that, I'll say that in my closing thoughts would be to remember that organizations are people, that your organizational values should be your personal values, that you have to personalize this. And as Michael Jackson would say, it starts with the man in the mirror, and then ripples outwards, because that's where we are people. We build organizations. We should not be serving organizations. Organizations should be serving us. And then finally, I think that the power of reflection is really important. My call to action is actually not do anything, but reflect on what should be done before you act, because sometimes there's more damage in doing something without thought that you can't roll back than it is to take a moment to breathe and really think through it and then move. And I would also offer one last thing. There's a wonderful book called The Originals, How Nonconformists Move the World. And it talks about how things don't need to look the way we're used to having them look in order to work and be successful and be effective.
Great. Thank you, Teresa. Quo, final thoughts from you.
Yeah. Thank you all. This has been a wonderful conversation. I would say my final thoughts are that we have to, again, seek truth. We need to look at historical context. We did not get here just because. We are here. People put this system in place. We have to be deliberate about dismantling it. And that means, as Teresa said, we have to reflect. But we also need to understand that racism has robbed all of us, every last one of us, of something. It has robbed us of the ability to connect with someone. We can't do it because of the color of someone's skin. Like, what is that, right? Because of national, what is that? So be mindful that as we have all been robbed, we must take this back, right? And that our art form, opera, has the ability to regain that connection, to establish that connection. As Nina said, reach out to people, reach out to others, do so with humility. There are consultants, there are many organizations doing racial equity work. Reach out, right? Start that step and know that you don't have to do it alone.
Thank you, Quo, and thank all of you for everything that you've shared with us today. I want to lift up and affirm all of the wonderful insight and commentary and thoughts that you've shared. This is such an amazing panel. I'm so glad that we got to share this with the world. And I also just want to encourage all of you to be brave. In my house, we're having a lot of conversations with my 4-year-old about being brave doesn't mean you ignore that you are afraid. Being brave means acknowledging your fear and your discomfort and moving past it anyway. So go out there, be brave. Mark, thank you so much for having us here and having this wonderful conversation.
Alejandra, thank you for moderating such an incredible discussion. It is the most intense, most honest I think we've had at any conference. And the technology may have helped us by bringing these incredible panelists right to our screen, right into this room. It was a magnificent discussion. Thank you. We're going to talk a little bit about next week. Next week is the 4th installment and the final one in our 2020 conference, our online conference. We start on June 1, that's Monday, with a 2 o'clock lead presentation from Adrian Ellis, the director of AEA Consulting. And then we'll see that again on Wednesday, June 3rd. The panel, which will be facilitated by our board chair, Timothy O'Leary, will start at 2 o'clock and go until 3:30. Again, we're talking about making change. And we've covered so many topics so far in the conference about technology, today about about belonging and creating real belonging. If we want to make change in our organizations, how do we do it? We're going to focus on that next week. Again, the lead presentation, June 1 at 2, the panel discussion on June 3rd at 2 o'clock. For all of you who've been with us for this hour and a half plus, thank you for being with us. Thank you again to Fisher Dax for sponsoring this session. Have a good rest of week, and we'll see you next week. Thank you.